formal conversation because we didn't really set this up as a major one. And part of that was because I realized all too late that the Kentucky Derby was going to be running at 4 o'clock our time. And I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but I will say it was a photo finish. Very exciting.
It's one of the best races I've seen.
It
for a long
was.
time. I watch the Derby every single year. I
Do
never
you?
miss it. Oh, yeah. I've got family in Kentucky.
Oh, well, that
Actually,
explains
a
it.
distant cousin was a breeder at the Calumet Farms back in the 70s.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
So I've always had a connection with horse racing.
Well, my parents were friends with J. Graham Brown, so they used
Oh,
to
wow.
go and sit in his box, you know, the
Nice.
Brown Hotel in Louisville and all. But anyway, it was a great race, and this is the 150th anniversary of the Derby. So that's part of the reason why we set this up to
Right.
be 5 o'clock. So we're here to talk about the heist, and I have to say, and this conversation came up with one of the fans here, that as different authors have picked up Clive's characters, the characters themselves have changed somewhat, haven't they, Jack?
I'd say they have. We all put our stamp on it.
Right.
You know, like, again, Justin Scott was more of a mystery writer, so he wrote more of the detective side of Isaac Bell, and that was never my forte. So I've kind of, focused more on the action side of his character.
Absolutely. Sorry, the table is rocking.
Yeah,
So
water's dancing.
it's definitely more of a thriller, and it's very timely because, in fact, it opens on a presidential yacht cruise in the Potomac, where the bankers who are going to be setting up the Federal Reserve System are on board with Woodrow Wilson.
For me,
And
yeah.
I think considering all the, Federal Reserve conversation we're having about interest rates and all the rest of it, it's really very topical. And then, out of the blue, an airplane appears, and it bombs the yacht. And I thought how much Clive would have loved that, because we think of Clive, as primarily maritime.
Right.
But Clive really loved old planes.
Oh, he did. Oh, yeah. Oh, he
Yeah.
loved any old machines. He was fascinated by them.
No kidding.
Yep.
So in a way, the Isaac Bells are, in a lot of ways, the way Jack is writing them, truer to Clive in a lot of ways than some of the more modern ones.
In a sense, yeah.
I think so.
I remember my first meeting with Clive was at his house for the weekend, and we spent the last night chatting about Civil War monitors. The monitor, the Merrimack, the ironclads.
And the Huntley.
Yep.
'Cause that
and
was
he
one
knew
of
all about it.
Yeah, well, that was one of his
Yeah.
books that he and Craig Durgo wrote, 2 books, I think, about.
Yeah, of course, he discovered it.
Yeah, no, exactly. And in fact, we were just doing an inland waterway cruise
Oh,
in that area. And if you divert, you can actually go and see, I think it's outside Charleston.
it is.
You
Yep,
can
they have a
go and
separate
see
museum.
the Huntley. We
Yep.
didn't have time, but when we passed it, I said to Rob, I wish Clive were here. I often wish Clive were
Yeah,
here.
me
I
too.
mean,
I miss him.
we spent 30 happy years together, so I really miss him. But anyway, it's wonderful that that the series is continuing. So that's a very dramatic start. What interested you in taking? I mean, you're moving Isaac up in time, so we're before. Where are we in time in this book?
We're in 1914, 1915.
So it is before we entered the war.
It is before the end of the war. I've been setting the books consistently a year or two after the previous one. Even though
Okay.
the character Clive said he can jump anywhere he wants to, I just have a hard time with that time-wise.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been leading up the 5 books I've written are, in my interpretation, at least, how America is becoming a country on the world stage. And how Bell is a part of each step of that. So like the book, The Saboteur, is about the Panama Canal. And then I had the Wolf Pack,
Right.
or the Sea Wolves rather, where we're starting to see German interest in the United States as being a rival. And then this story is more about how the Federal Reserve became like the first big part of the government that went into everybody's lives. Prior to that, all the banks were run by state charter. And this is like the first federal thing, and it's becoming, we're one of the last civilized, industrialized nations rather that had a central bank. And this is again the beginning of what would be called the big government era, and so
It
it
really
fascinated me.
is,
And
yeah.
that kind of brought us more onto the world stage. And the work I'm writing now is about actually our entrance into the war.
Excellent. So Wilson will still be president.
Yes.
So part of this is, as you point out, that we are seeing, the printing of the $100 bill, the actual. And interestingly enough, we have a book on May 20th from an author named Graham Moore, which is about the economics behind Germany's recovery from the Depression following World War I and how it built their war machine and the U.S. reaction to it. And
Yep.
part of it is that the British economist John Maynard Keynes wanted the world to stay on sterling. He wanted England still to be the world currency, whereas our government was working towards establishing the dollar.
The dollar is the
As
dollar,
and
yeah.
so when I read your book, because I read Graham's slightly before, I thought about they really pair very well together.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
So naturally, if we're going to have the first $100 bills printed, we're probably looking at either some kind of a theft or a counterfeit, or something is going to happen with those $100 bills.
Usually when I write a story, I have the genesis of the idea.
Yeah.
You know, something, I remember sitting in my back deck during a rainstorm, and I just finished Titanic Savers, about maybe halfway through it. And I said, I've never seen Isaac Bell in a jungle. It just popped in my head. It's like a really lush backyard. And I was like, what's going on jungly at this point in time? And I immediately thought of the Panama Canal. So that's kind of the genesis of the whole idea. With this one, I had the title, The Heist. I just loved that title. And I ran it by Dirk Cussler, and he said, I don't care what gets stolen. You have to write The Heist. That's just such a great title.
Yes.
So I had this title, but I had absolutely zero idea what I wanted to do with it. I did, what are we going to steal, like, some sort of gemstones? And so again, just doing research on things that are happening at that time. And, one of the websites that has, day by day for the year. And it is on this day the Federal Reserve Bank opened, and it was, I think, 1914, 1915, whatever it was. I'm like, well, if they have the Federal Reserve Bank, they have the Bureau of Printing and Engraving. And before they ship that money, there's going to be a ton of it in that building. So that's what we're going to steal. That's what's going to go after. And is Bell going to stop the theft? Is Bell going to be maybe, at one point, I had maybe even pressured into pulling off the heist himself? Yeah. Or is he going to stop it? I mean, so that's kind of where the whole thing came from. So once I had the Federal Reserve as my MacGuffin, then the story kind of wrote itself.
Sure. Well, it's easier than knocking out Fort Knox and
right?
going off with gold. It's a lot easier to take printed money. But the good news is that although we're starting out with airplanes, and it's really very dramatic, we eventually do, and I'm no spoiler here, but we eventually do get to water and a boat. So I thought you really could hardly write a Cussler that didn't at some point.
At some point. You mean dramatic chases. That's what I love about like television shows. Is they can have an action scene which is just the actors are running down the street with really dramatic music, and it works. It's, oh, that was so exciting. You write that in a book, no one cares. So you have to come up with new and different things, and I won't give away too much, but the climax of the book takes place on some of the early first airboats that were invented.
Exactly. I was going to say, you brought in the new technology there, too.
Which, again, I don't know where I stumbled upon that, but Alexander Graham Bell actually invented the airboat up in Canada about a year before this. And so I'm like, well, it exists there, so someone else can copy his idea, and we'll have airboats.
Well, and they work out extremely well. So, again, Jack works out a really interesting, I can't tell you about it, but there's a terrific murder investigation, and then another terrific murder investigation. So you do actually have, a mystery.
Mystery
it is a thriller, but there's...
I've been working on getting more and more into that.
Well, no, it isn't that you need to, but what I thought was that this book, a lot of the interest of this book is the mechanics of how all the different things work in it. And one of the interesting mechanics is the murder. And I thought, did you practice? Did you actually set up the,
how that was pulled off?
Yes.
I thought it through very carefully.
I'll bet you did.
Yeah, that was a tricky one to pull off. But again, the twist of it, I loved. I mean, that was just, it came out so much better than I expected. It really did. There's actually one thing Dirk talked to me about changing a little bit. It was, the villain's almost too good. I'm like, no, he's got to be that good to really make it work.
So you all gather from this that Dirk has taken over Clive's role as kind of the, producer, editor, and so forth of the series, and he's still writing Dirk Cussler, although...
The Dirk Pitt novels, he is.
Sorry, Dirk Pitt novels. I still think... You're right. How could anybody but Dirk Cussler write Dirk Pitt? Although
right.
Someday that might actually have to change, but...
I don't know how he's doing it.
Well, I'm not sure that, he'll be able to do it forever, but, Graham has hung in there all these years. Graham was my discovery, for those of you who don't know this. Graham had published... You didn't know that?
No.
Graham wrote two absolutely terrific...
I love them both.
Little mass market paperback originals for Bantam.
Black Rain was one of them.
Something like that.
I just reread it not that long ago. It still holds up.
And when I read it, I thought to myself, this is perfect for Clive. So I took both the paperbacks and went up to knock back a tequila or two with Clive. And I said to him, you know, since you're really moving into co-authors, this is your guy.
Really?
Yeah. And
Perfect.
they've been together
I think
ever since.
13 books
Yeah.
they've done.
Do you know, I counted up, and the actual number of books that Clive wrote by himself was something like only 17 or 18. You look at this, you know, huge, the page, you know, when you open this book, the huge number of books. But Clive on his own,
Yep.
I think it was like eight.
I think it was 17 Dirk Pitt novels and then The Chase, the first Isaac Bell.
Okay, so 18.
Yep.
And then he had co-authors for nonfiction, and then Paul Comprechos came in, and then, so, you know, the output is huge. And I think maybe that's made it easier for everybody without Clive to keep reading, you know, the books that the co-authors
yeah.
have read, because he worked with all of you for so long
Right.
that you're really still in the Cussler verse, as we call it.
Very much so. And that's why I'm really especially proud of Mike Madden, who came in to take over the Oregon files, because he never worked with Clive.
No.
But his books are terrific.
I think so too, but he wrote in the Clancy verse, if I remember
did he?
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Or maybe he wrote on his own. But anyway, I really like
Yeah.
Mike, and we
Yep.
had several of his books here before he started writing.
Yeah, because I mean, when I read it, I was reluctant because I
No,
I kind of
he's very good.
made Juan my own, but when I read his version, I was like, this sounds just like the Cabrillo I imagine.
Now
And it's
he's-
like kind of neat seeing words coming out of Juan's mouth that I didn't write, and then I don't know what's going to happen next. But
Yeah.
it was a joy.
No, he's very good. So the Van Dorn Detective Agency, you are committed to the scenario that Clive set up and then Justin wrote in for a while.
Yes.
You can't really dissolve all those things. So how have you gone about trying to make them your own?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, like I said, with Isaac himself, I've done, you know, the way Justin had written him was he was a little more formal, always tipped his hat to women, always said ma'am, always wore a white suit. It's kind of a trademark. And I wanted to get away from that side of his character. You know, I wanted to show him a little more tough guy, a little more Dirk Pitt-like. You know, fast on his feet, quick thinking, but also good with his hands. And so I focused more on that side of the character than the mystery-solving side of it.
I'm going to now reveal, I can't remember this. What year does any of you remember what year the first Isaac Bell was set in?
1906.
Ah, good, you know.
Yeah.
All right, so obviously times have changed
Yes.
between, and so it was more formal, I think, in 1906, as generally speaking.
that's true.
By the time you work your way through the war, the 1920s is
Yeah.
an entirely different era.
Yeah, they did set one of the books in 1920 during the beginning of Prohibition, called The Bootlegger. It's one of Justin's books.
Okay. So he did move back and forth.
Yeah, he did move back and forth at the time. That's what a little tricky for me, because Isaac Bell's been with his now wife, Marion, for years. They still don't have any kids. So I'm like, her clock is ticking. I hate to say this, but there's no kids mentioned in the 1920 book, so I can't introduce it yet.
Oh, that's a good thought. Well, not everybody had children,
Right.
you know.
Well, later on in one of the epilogue of one of his books, they mentioned that he did have a couple of kids.
Could have adopted them.
That's a good point. That's a
You
good
know,
point.
That's a,
Yep, I
a
didn't think about that.
possibility
Yep.
too. Maybe, you know, not every couple is
Yeah,
fertile.
I
but
could work that into the next
adoption,
one. I
you
like
could.
this.
That's why authors come here. Give them plot points.
Let me write this down.
Whatever it is, right? That's okay. I'll email you. But anyway, so we start out actually in this book. We have this great airplane chase, and then we segue to a murder scene in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, I have to say, when you were describing the house and all, I have been to Newport several times, and I've actually hiked the entire cliff walk.
Oh, did you?
Yep. And so your description of the house, you know, with the garden in the back rolling along with the
Down to the
buildings
water.
and then eventually to the water. Yes, although if you saw a sandy beach, the cliff walk is
Yep.
actually quite high.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But that's okay. There's beach below it.
Yep.
So, you know, I figured you just were looking over it. But those big estates at Newport, I thought you described the house where the murder has taken place really well.
Thank you. I've actually been there myself as a kid. I very vaguely remember it. But I did, you know, there's a lot of, again, online pictures and books about those massive estates. And so I kind of picked pieces of each one and kind of throw together into, one big place. But
Yeah.
it was a crazy time. But without income tax, people kept all the money they had. So these wealthy families could spend it on whatever they wanted to.
And often they had, but it's not that different than the tech barons today. I mean, Jeff
Yeah.
Bezos and his $150 million yacht is not really any different
Yeah,
than,
good point.
although you did mention, which I kind of like, the fact that, they probably had a summer place somewhere
Yo,
up north. And,
I can't remember the
and
name of the lake in upstate New York.
well, people in the Gilded, some of them had summer homes in Maine, some in Canada,
Yep.
some of them, Minnesota
Yeah.
had, northern Minnesota had a bunch.
Yeah, actually, I just this past winter did the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Have you ever seen that? It's spectacular.
I've been there many times.
Yep.
I used to live near there.
Oh, did you?
Yep. Yeah. So the Gilded Age had the same number of, maybe even more billionaires. There's a place called Jackal Island. Have any of you been to Jackal Island? At one point, they pointed out, somewhere in the early 1900s, 1/6 of the world's wealth was on
Jackal
Island. Yeah, because the Rockefellers and the Goulds and all those families that had so much money, and they had a season that was like from early January to the end of March or something, and they would go down there, and it was like a hunting and other thing. But that was really scary when they said that 1/6 of the world's
amazing.
wealth
That is
was
incredible.
on that
Yeah.
island, and that was they would come in on their yachts, and I remember my husband's great grandfather Julius Rosenwald. He had his own railroad car, but that was now it's a private
Yeah.
plane,
Yeah,
but
it's
back
the
then
exact
you
same
would
thing.
have
Yep.
something like
Yep.
a railroad car or your own yacht or something or other.
One of my early ideas for the book was about Jekyll Island and some of the meetings that took place down there, but I never found a way to really incorporate it in. But as I was gaming this book, I'm like, because I knew about it, I knew they all met down there.
They did, and what ended it was the Depression, and then the Second World War, and eventually the state of Georgia has bought Jekyll Island for very low dollar. I mean, the people who built homes there didn't recoup their money
Right. Oops.
at all. But for a while, it was
The place to be.
yeah,
Yeah.
spectacular. So yeah, I could see Isaac
Yep.
Bell
Yep.
doing a thing. So the Van Doren Detective Agency, did you model that a bit on the Pinkerton Agency? Or not you, but when it was set
Clive,
up.
Yeah, Clive kind of like that. The big exception is Pinkertons would also work strike breaking. And Clive said, I don't want them to do anything like that at all. I mean, they're always going to be the good guys. But very much like that. Because, I mean, again, there was no, the FBI wasn't a thing. So law enforcement, you basically stopped at your county line or your town line, or at the very most, your state line. So there was not a whole lot of coordination. So, agencies like Pinkerton or the fictional Van Dorn, could operate all across the country. Using telegraph offices and say, look, this person's coming to town on this train, they're wanted for murder or whatever it is, and they could be there ready to pick them up.
Yeah, the Pinkertons operated during the Civil War. They actually had a woman named, what was her name? Kate Warren was a Pinkerton agent. So, guys like Pinkerton and Fred Harvey actually gave women some job opportunities that up until then were pretty much lacking. So I've always thought, that was.
And she was a very effective agent.
She was. She died very young. She
Yeah.
died at 35. She wasn't actually killed in action. I don't know why she died, but anyway, the Van Dorns. So Isaac is not actually the head of the agency. He's their lead investigator.
Right.
And Joseph Van Dorn, is it Joseph?
Yes.
Joseph
Yeah.
Van Dorn is
Yeah.
the actual agency head. So he kind of hobnobs with
The rich and powerful,
rich and
politicians. He spent
powerful.
a lot of time in the Willard Hotel in D.C. You're trying to get government contracts. I did talk with Clive about that. It's like, why didn't you have Isaac as like the run the company? He says, always good to have someone above your character so they can order him to do something he wouldn't want to do normally. So take a mission he wouldn't want. That's why Dirk Pitt wasn't the head of NUMA for most of the books. There's always someone to give him, was it Sandecker, to give him orders,
right?
to give him orders. So you have to go do this. Just today or whatever. No, you have to go take that mission. So they give an excuse to go out and do something you would normally do.
At the same time, though, the character had to have huge initiative.
Yeah. Oh,
so
yeah.
even if he was sometimes doing something he maybe didn't want to do, he also wasn't on much of a leading string.
No.
Not much of a rein was
Right.
put on him. Right. So the other thing I thought was so interesting about this is that there's a whole thing about states' rights. The abortion thing we're going through at the moment, and other questions about whether states or the federal government should control things, and that is really what this bit with the Federal Reserve was about. Is
This
that
was the
not
beginning of the federal government taking rights away from states.
right? And not every state or all the people who were working in that particular industry were happy about that.
No, they were not. I mean, a lot of the state chartered banks lost all their business. It was, I mean, again, it wiped out a lot of people. So the issuing of a federal currency, I mean, again, changed, again, every state had their own currency. Every bank had their own currency. They had tons of clerks that their sole job was to convert money back and forth to make sure everything was on par. All those people were gone. All those jobs were wiped out. So it was a big thing for the government to do that. I mean, it was an important thing. The economy needed it because we constantly have these bank runs and these panics that, I mean, would wipe out the wealth of millions of people because one bank happened to fail for whatever reason, poor business decision, whatever they did wrong. Next thing you know, every bank in that town, there's a panic going on there, and it spreads, from town to town, city to city.
Isn't
And
that whole thing with William Jennings Bryan in the early 1900s? I'm trying to remember. Wasn't that the thing going off the gold standard to the silver, or do I have that wrong?
I don't recall that.
There was. Sorry? Well, there was some change in, where the currency was going to either be devalued or not backed up. And one of the things in the book I mentioned by Graham Moore called The Wealth of Nations was that, and we could even see it now with bitcoins and all, is that in fact the government can just print all the money it wants to.
Absolutely.
It doesn't. If you have a federal system, you don't actually have to have it tied to gold or silver. They can just keep printing money, which is maybe what we're going to be seeing happening. But Bitcoin is another attempt to have a global currency that isn't tied to the dollar
to
or
anything.
to the pound
Yep.
or to the euro. And I think that's part of the reason why the Bitcoin thing keeps going. It's also great for criminals,
Yep.
so it does
Yeah.
allow all that to happen. So anyway, there are a lot of things in the heist that are relevant to where we are, even if it's set in 1914 or 15. It could be going on
Yeah.
today. Right. So do any of you have questions that you would like to ask?
Well, now I have an historical question, if I may.
Sure.
Well, if you have all these state-issued, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
About the currency.
Yeah.
If you have state-issued currency and you open a federal bank, did they not back that money, or did they
You could convert it. You could convert, and they had to figure out. I don't know exactly how they determine the rates. That's one thing I didn't really get too deep into the woods on that because again, in my story, it's more the adventure than the practical side of it. But a lot of people were reluctant to convert their money and then ended up losing it because they didn't think the dollar was going to work. We had a national currency back in the Civil War that eventually failed. So it was a tough experiment. I mean, you literally had to get people that, say from some small town that knows the banker, that could be their cousin or the family banker or whatever. They know this family forever. They trust this family. They trust their decisions. Now you're asking, and so you don't mind giving them your money because you know it's safe. They're going to take good care of it, and you'll get it back whenever you want it back. Now you're forced to trust a bureaucrat in D.C. you've never heard of before. So a lot of people were very reluctant over this whole thing. It was a big reach for the government.
But that's also true with the euro. The Swiss still have the Swiss franc. They didn't go, and that's one of the constant issues with Britain is they didn't want to give up the pound in order to go to the euro. So I had, I'm trying to remember which country it was. Maybe it was France. I had a bunch of francs or something, and when I was there, I had to convert them, and I have no idea whether I lost money or what,
Probably
because
lost.
he handed up, probably did. But that's always a risk with currency, is that it might not be valued. Or, if you go to Canada, the value of the Canadian dollar goes up and down compared to the American dollar, which is really why it's better to pay with credit cards than cash most of the time
Nowadays,
anymore.
yeah, for sure.
In fact, a lot of places, we were flying home from Quebec. There was no place in the Quebec airport that took cash. You had to use a credit card to do anything. And we had some Canadian money I wanted to get rid of, and I couldn't. Ended up bringing it home because they wouldn't accept it. Well, part of it is safety. If you're cashless, you don't have to worry about, people arriving, to stick up the register. But a lot of it is just that way they don't have to worry about the
Conversion rate, yeah.
the conversion rate.
Yep.
Yeah, you can just bounce up and down and go from there. Did anybody else have a question?
I was just going to say, talking about Canada, when I was a kid, we lived just south of the Canadian border.
Yeah.
And at the time, in that area, the money exchanged 1-to-1. Even though the official exchange rate varied, if you walked in to a store with a pink dollar, they took it the same as a green dollar.
Where'd you grow up?
Shelby, Montana.
Okay.
I lived in Shelby.
Okay, I was in Burlington, Vermont. The same thing.
Yeah.
Just south of Montreal.
Well, it
Yeah.
was easier
Yeah.
that way.
It just you never think about it, like the quarter.
If
Yeah.
if you walked in with a $100 bill,
No, but
they're going to talk to
Yeah.
you about it. But if you walk in with a $5,
yeah, wouldn't blink an eye. Yeah, we the same way. That's funny.
It makes perfectly good sense. It really does. So anyway, we have a whole states' rights issue going on in this book, which I think we haven't finished litigating. In fact, we sort of, we're back into it
Right.
on several issues.
Yeah.
So, it's a constant. Maybe the Civil War is never going to be entirely over. I sometimes think about that.
Again, the people forget. Again, the federal side has taken up so much control and power that we keep forgetting. Individual states have their own constitutions, basically, and how they want to have different rules for how they want to live.
The only reason we're going to do an interesting program on Wednesday night, Lawrence Goldstone, who's a constitutional scholar and a historian, is coming over to talk to us about the origins of the Constitution. And many of the things in the Constitution were simply a compromise in order to try to get the 13 states to sign on for it.
It's all compromise.
Because the Articles of
90%.
the Articles of Confederation lacked two things. There was no power to tax, and there was no power to raise an army. So, we were a fledgling country that didn't have any ability to either raise money
Or defend ourselves.
send out an army. So the Constitution was a whole bunch of compromising between like a very rural South and a
Right.
much more industrial
Right.
North and a much more populated area. Why is it that Wyoming has the same number of senators than New York, for example? All of it, the Electoral College, all of that is like 200 and some years old. And at some point, up until Trump, everybody kind of went with it. It was vague and it wasn't well defined, but there were, he showed us where all the holes were.
Yeah.
And, that we may need, in fact, to think about revamping it.
He dug quite a few of them himself.
Well, we survived that long because nobody challenged it. The Civil War challenged it. But once we got past the Civil War, we all kind of accepted it. Nobody, the idea that the president would refuse to leave hadn't come up.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether our Constitution is going to have to be revamped. The British Constitution is not even written.
Is it really?
Oh no, no.
I didn't
It's
know
just
that.
kind of it's a kind of understood and procedural and all this other stuff. And that's one reason why if you fashion too specific a constitution, then it can get outdated. And so the more flexible one works until you find somebody that says, I'm not going to abide by all these
Right.
conventions. I'm going to do something different. So we're in an interesting time. And that really is part of what Jack is writing about in this book in regard to the banking is are the bankers going to accept it
Right.
or not? So I found it fascinating. Besides, the plane is so cool. I really love the whole, there's the plane flying. And the plane, it's this little tiny plane. And you think, can it really carry a bomb? Or is it going to make it? I was waiting for the plane to fall into the water rather than the bomb.
The one thing I love doing is getting the technical stuff 100% accurate. So what I wrote, that can absolutely happen, for sure.
I'm sure it is. No, in fact, Jack has written a very interesting article, and I'll put a link to it in the next e-news about research and how it is that he's able to do all these things by looking it up.
And how it makes me, I think, a better writer. It really does.
Well, and obviously you're interested in it.
Yeah.
And
well,
you know what? If you were bored, we'd be bored.
That's it.
So,
That's it. That's it.
And I'm glad that you are finding this interesting
Yeah,
and keeping going.
Again, I really didn't have much interest in writing this series when Clive first approached me. But now that I've gotten into it, doing the research, I have so much fun. Especially language. What were these words used back then? Were these phrases used? Idioms, things like that.
And the other good news is you don't have to keep up with contemporary technology.
Exactly.
You don't have
It
to
makes it much
constantly
easier.
disable cell phones. And I think, I think you've got a really good path there to follow.
It's-
And there's enough mechanical stuff on sea and on land and in air that you can stay true to the sort of Cussler ethos.
Well, I had years and years ago an idea of a techno thriller series, kind of like the original Clancy stuff, but set during World War One. So now that I'm writing my World War One book, I finally get 40 years later, 35 years later, I get to write that book. So I'm looking forward to doing the research for that.
I love it. All right.
There you go.
It'll be fun. So, is there any other questions? Jacob, are there any questions online? Are you awake back there? No questions. Okay.
I have one for you, Barbara.
I'll get to you in a minute.
Have authors you've talked to and talked about AI, have they been concerned?
We haven't really brought up AI here at the store, so not so far.
Okay.
I think I'm kind of a first line of defense against it because,
Okay.
you know, I can probably work out whether this is the actual voice. I would have trouble with a brand new author, you know, knowing it, but for the authors that I've read, I
Yeah.
certainly would be able to tell.
Because I had a friend do one of the, whatever AI he used, I don't even forget, but it said, write a Isaac Bell book set in Japan in the style of Jack DuBrul. And it came up with maybe about 10, 12 pages. Absolutely garbage. It was horrible.
Well, the Japan part might have thrown it,
Yeah.
but I think it's a scary thing. I've actually had people ask, companies ask me if AI would like to take over writing our newsletter and all, and I'm no,
No.
you know, no. But I do think that it is going to be an increasing.
Yeah.
know,
I mean, it is getting more and more refined, for sure.
It is. We even have the mailing program that we use, which originates out of the U.S. and which is a little awkward in that it doesn't take images well. I get a message every time about whether I'd like AI to write the headlines. You know, when I write it, I say no.
I'll pass.
But you know,
Yeah.
I think we have to allow for the idea that there's going to be more of it. But I also think that that's going to be an interesting subject for thrillers and science fiction.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
for
once
sure.
you've got a new tool, I think that people are going to want to talk about it or use it in
Yeah.
some way.
Yeah.
Who knew that cell phones were going to become so dominant that a constant problem for anybody writing a thriller or a mystery and all is how to get the cell phone out of the way?
Out of the picture, right?
And I remember reading one of my very favorite, I'm trying to think of the name of the author, it'll come to me. But anyway, it's set in London, this is a long time ago, and it starts with what looks like a kind of a hit and run in front of the Chelsea Flower Show. And then the detective, I think he's a private eye, but he might be a cop, I can't remember which, begins to think maybe it wasn't, and he looks at whatever he can look at and sees that there's a guy with a particularly flashy, like a Nike shoe, but a very distinctive shoe, and he tracks him using CCTV from the Chelsea Flower Show across London, down into the underground, all the way to the other end, comes back up, goes to an apartment, rides up in the elevator, and eventually ends up in his apartment, and they can follow him on camera the entire way by looking at these shoes.
Amazing.
And this was like 10, 12, 15 years ago that happened. And I think that if you watch a British crime show now, the first thing the cops call for every time, look at the, you know, the CCTV, what, you know, for people driving.
Because they're everywhere, in London especially.
As far as not just London. I mean, I watched Vera last night. There's a new episode of Vera, and Clive's thing, and that's the first thing that, you know, they say there's a hit and run. And she calls immediately, you know, for the cameras, you know, is the license plate going to show? What does the car show? And they're actually able to bring up a picture towards the end and see who was driving. So, you know, it's really changed the way detection or cops are going to work, you know, if you have this kind of technology.
Or the old, what an author will do say, you know, they knew the cameras are there, they turn their face every time, so you never get to use that technology.
I can't believe that criminals don't leave their phones at home. And, you know, it's like the Capitol rioters, or remember the people up here at the mall that broke into and across the Apple store and went over to the Mercedes? They all got caught because they all not only had their cameras, but they were actually posting it, you know, on social media. It's just, if you were going to...
There is a scientific term for that.
Yeah, stupid.
Stupid.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, so in a way, it's a godsend, you know, but in another way, it's a real challenge. It's certainly a challenge for writers, I think.
Oh, yeah. But again, I mean, in the end, the criminal has to make a mistake. If it not, you don't have a story.
Otherwise, it's a perfect crime.
The perfect crime, exactly. So I mean, there's got to be some slip up. That's why in this book, I forget what his slip up is, but it's pretty small. You know, but it doesn't. But you know, because again, he's.
I remember what it
yeah.
is, and you're right. It's
Yeah.
actually very small,
Yeah.
but still, it's very cool. Right. You had one more question.
Oh, sir.
Well, it's just, I don't know if this is a dumb question, but so you mentioned
There's only dumb answers.
There
Don't
are
worry.
no dumb questions.
that Clive Cussler had originally approached you about writing.
Mm-hmm.
So do you just say to Dirk, "Hey, I've got this idea, and I want to write this," and or how does that work?
That's how it has worked. You know, like when Clive first approached me to do the Oregon Files, I was the third book in the series. I'd read the first one. They gave me an advanced reader's copy of the second, and he said, "This is the characters. This is the setup. You know, write me an outline and a couple sample chapters." And so I came up with this idea about smuggling nuclear waste, and wrote up the chapters, sent it to Clive. He flew me out to Phoenix, and he said, "I like your style. I like how you write. The problem is that nuclear smuggling has been done to death. Come up with something different." And actually, he said, "Then I'm going to take a nap. I'll give you an hour." I had an hour to come up with it, but I came up with human trafficking.
Clive.
Yeah, that's typical Clive.
Yeah.
So I came up with a human trafficking angle of it, with the snakeheads out of China, and what they're actually, the bad guys are hijacking the ships of illegal immigrants and using for slave labor. So that was my first idea, and then Clive liked the book. He said, think of something else." So I'm like, all right, and then I came up with Skeleton Coast, and so that's kind of how I keep doing it. So we've been working with Dirk. What's the Seawolves? Yeah, I said I want to do something with lighthouses signaling U-boats off the coast, and I want to have Isaac Bell on the Lusitania. And I want him to be the reason they have to torpedo it. So he has got some vital thing the Germans need to stop. And so that's what I pitched him. And he said, "All right, write out, 10, 12-page outline, get some other scenes, he'll figure it out." And that's kind of how we work it out. So we each individual of the authors themselves comes up with the idea, but they're framed within the universe that Clive built, whether it's the Oregon Files, Numa Files, or these books.
So Jack originally wrote a different series.
Yeah, the Oregon
Isaac
Files.
Bell, the Oregon
8
Files,
of those.
and then Blake Morrison wrote some, and now Mike Madden.
Yep.
And as you point out, Mike is the only person that didn't actually have a hands-on experience with Clive.
Oh, he regrets it.
Fortunately, the rest of us have,
Yeah.
so we can wrestle him into shape. Yeah, Clive, took on much more of an editorial than a writing, and Dirk is now doing the same. Because basically you're working for Dirk.
For Dirk now, yeah.
Yeah.
And those are two completely different skills, editing and writing.
Yeah.
They're completely
And then there
different.
is also an editor at the publisher. Putnam also has an editor. So, you send a book to
Yep.
Dirk and all, but then that book has to be submitted to the publisher. And that publisher does a lot of legacy publishing. They're publishing the Clancy books. They're publishing the Robert Parker books. They're publishing both Clancy series, in fact, and the Cussler books, and I'll try to remember something else. And fortunately, for us, almost all of them come here. Well, they do. So, it just works out.
Right.
And I think a lot of that is because you fans don't want to let the characters go. It's hard enough to lose Clive, but you really don't want to lose, all the characters that Clive created. And over, this will be 35, the store will be 35 years old in October, so I've been doing this for a really long time. My experience is that when an author dies, fans rarely say, "I'm really going to miss the author." What they immediately say is, they're going to miss the character.
The character.
Because, the author for most readers is kind of a vehicle, to the character and to the world. And I think it says a lot for Clive that that so many fans still want to stay in that universe.
Yep.
Same thing with Tom Clancy, same thing with Vince Flynn.
Yeah.
Well, the handoff came from Kyle to Don here last September, and now Don will be here, and I think Kyle is going to come, and we're going to flip it, to go. I think it's hilarious that an 83-year-old lady is like the epicenter of military fiction, but nonetheless it works out. But that's because you fans, really want to do that. And I have to say it's been great for me because, I was basically much more of a romance and biography and historic. And I really enjoyed reading military fiction. I do it because I read all the books for all the authors that come here. And I would have missed a lot.
Right.
Because I don't know that naturally I would have taken them up, you know. But it's never a good idea to finesse I'll still remember David Baldacci. Hi, David. David Baldacci wrote to me and he said he really wanted to do an event with Jake Tapper, the CNN guy, because Jake had a new book out. And so I thought, well, that'll be great, you know. So we set it all up and everything was fine. And I could have just finessed reading Jake's book, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, it was going to be David and I was
Yeah.
just going to sit there, you know, on
Right.
Zoom like a big dummy. And at 2 minutes to the hour, David was in a tornado or some kind of a storm and was not going to be able to connect. And I realized as the hour comes up that I am going to be doing Jake. And I thought to myself, thank God I read the book.
You did read it.
You know, because
Yep.
it would have been really hard to finesse it if I hadn't actually read it. So I do stick to that rule because you absolutely never know
You never know.
how it's going to work out. Anyway, thank you all for coming
Thank you.
today. Thank you, online fans, for watching it. Jack has signed a whole bunch, and we have about 3 or 4 dozen left. So if you're wanting to get an autographed copy of The Heist, do it while we still have it. So thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Barbara.